You're listening to Catholic Family Podcast. Episode 13.
Thanks for listening. I'm Kevin Davis, and I'm joined yet again today by Eric Kosovich. He was here with me on the last show talking about Society and Sanity, a book by Frank Sheed. In episode 1, we talked about the first 2/3 of the book structure, about man being the raw material of society, and the second part being family being the building block of society. Today, we want to talk about society itself and how we are to act in a society, and also a little bit about authority and our responsibilities to follow the proper authority. This could be a little bit of an interesting subject that I think especially Americans might be gripping their chairs at the end of the show. But I'm very happy to have Eric back. And I do want to say before we get going that we are both not moral authorities. We're not theologians. We are not priests. We are just talking from our own thoughts and feelings and opinions about a very interesting book and a very interesting topic. So if you have any questions about this, please bring it to a priest and not to us. If you have any issues with what we're saying, it's very possible we are wrong. We're not perfect, and we're just trying to do our best to talk about a very important topic. So Eric, thank you again for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And
I didn't get a chance to bring this up last time, but yep. I love your theme music, the intro. That's from Master and Commander, isn't it?
It is. And I actually, when I first started the first couple of shows, I kind of played around to see, maybe I'll do a different one every show. And I just, every time I heard the show with that intro, I just loved it. So I was just like, okay, I have to just stick with it. And I love the movie too, by the way. That's one of the very few movies that I think you can totally actually recommend. Like, I can actually recommend that movie, Master and Commander. It's really good, epic war movie. I sat down actually last week and tried to watch it with Ina, and she just couldn't do it. She could not get it. She couldn't get into it. But I enjoyed every minute of it. So Master and Commander, that's where the music comes from. It's actually from the movie. The captain and the doctor of the ship, they go into their cabin and play cello and violin, and it's very good. Very, and I know Eric loves it too. So we both recommend Master and Commander.
Awesome song, awesome movie.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. I have to read the book sometime. I think there's a book about it.
Oh,
I think it was based on a book, I think, but I could be wrong. I don't know. Anyway. So speaking of books, we're talking again about Society and Sanity by Frank Sheed. This book was written in 1953. I think we said in the last episode. And talking again about society, man being the raw material and the family being the building block of society. Now we're going to talk about society itself. So Eric, I don't know, where's a good place to start talking about society?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe just a really quick recap of the first two sections. And the first section being man, what man is when you look at it from a sane lens, right? Viewing man as he is, and sort of the fundamental reason that man is to be valued in not only society but in general, and that reason being a three-part reason, that man was created in the image of God by God, that man has an immortal soul that will live forever, and that Christ died on the cross for each individual man. So, and viewing man with those three reasons for value, a healthy society has to understand all of those things about man. You can't build a society around man without knowing and basing that on those three reasons that man is valuable. And then the second part of the book was the family. So, if man is the raw material, the family is the building block of society. A strong society requires strong families, and that the family unit is definitely, you can tell the health of a society based on the health of its families.
And so then I guess the next obvious question is, why does man, I should say, and why do families need society?
Yes. So the same way that, individuals can't satisfy their own needs, they need a family. In the exact same way, and just sort of progressing from there, a family can't satisfy the needs of all its members without society. Society is necessary for mankind. I will point out that Sheed has an interesting comment here that, a lot of people, and I think this is very applicable to today, a lot of people think that the church is a suitable substitute for society. And he's very clear to point out that that is not the case. Life in the supernatural society, which is the church, was never meant as a substitute for life in a natural society. And part of the reason for that is, in a way, it's too special, right? The structure and the functions of the church were made by God. And as a member of the church, you can't exercise the same ownership and contribution that is built into the nature of man, right? Man wants to contribute and to be at least a part owner of his society. So that function that is built into man needs a society to fulfill it.
And so I guess I think we talk about this a little later on maybe, but I think a big argument I hear is that the best form of government then would not be for church, or I guess government being society, the leadership of the government of the society, is the best form of that is a Catholic monarchy, because then it's actually having the same morals as taught by the church, which is, of course, the church is the moral guide for society. We cannot guide society itself as a society, but it's the moral guide. So if you have a monarchy that is with this, has the same beliefs as the church, then obviously that must be the perfect form of government.
Sure. And we'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but Sheed is very quick to point out that society has to be built upon that raw material of man. And so regardless of what situation that society is in, the society has to match the people it's made up of. Right. So, and this is the problem with communism, socialism. There are many problems, but one of the major ones is that it's enforced on people who do not like it. And if the citizens of a particular society are not happy with that form of society, the society is not going to be healthy. So, so making the assumption, I guess, that, we should establish a Catholic monarchy in America right now would be almost every bit as disastrous as establishing communism on the people of America right now, because the makeup of the people does not match the structure of that society.
And that's because the people in America believe, even if it's falsely, in the idea of democracy, and that their voice matters, right? And so if that's the case, and if there's a monarchy and Americans believe fully in democracy or a republic, I suppose, then having someone who just comes in and is born into it, you're probably going to be rubbed the wrong way, is kind of what you're saying. Right.
Yep. And this is sort of skipping a little bit in advance of where Sheed takes his logical progression, but I think it's a really good segue. Right. There is no universally best political order. Right. And we were just talking, right, probably from a Catholic's perspective, a Catholic monarchy has been the most effective in, from a historical standpoint, at least as regards the spiritual well-being of its citizens. But the Catholic Church has never said this is the best form of Caesar.
Right.
Going back to our discussion in the first talk, right? Caesar is Sheed's word for the authority figure or figures, whether it's a king, a president, a Congress, whatever it is. He calls it Caesar in reference to our Lord's words, right? Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. The church has always been neutral on the form of Caesar. And there's a reason for that, because the church is sane, right? The Catholic Church sees things as they are, and sort of knows that establishing a one-size-fits-all society structure is not going to work with the different societies. So the church, has been neutral in the form of Caesar, the three major ones being dictatorship, monarchy, and republic.
Right.
And God can be served under all of them. And so that's why the church has never specified this as the ideal form.
Right. And so I guess that's another good segue into, okay, if the church doesn't say a perfect form or which one's ideal, does the church say, or is it implied that we need an authority, that we need someone to tell us what to do, I suppose, in a society, not in terms of morality, but in terms of how you run a society?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And society can't exist without authority. And that then she kind of goes into why that is, right? In every society, in every group of people, because the people are made of defective material, there will be individuals in that society that don't wish well upon their neighbors, right? There will be individuals that want to, whether for their own gain or just out of, a desire to do evil, will break laws, will sort of, wish ill and act ill upon their neighbors. And so a society has to have systems and laws in place, and not only in place, but enforced, to protect the individuals and families that make up that society.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't have society without authority. And, again, as a red-blooded American with occasional libertarian leaning ideas, that is sort of, it's a tough pill to swallow, right? It's built into the nature of humanity to need authority. And obviously that comes from God.
Well, and I guess it's hard to swallow, especially, right, as you say, as a libertarian, that, I think you and I would both believe that smaller...
Don't call me full-blooded libertarian, just,
okay, as somewhat libertarians, that we both somewhat believe that government should be smaller, and that if there is going to be authority, that it should be more localized. That's my opinion, at least, that if you're going to pay taxes and if there's going to be authority that I have to bow to and even vote for or whatever, then it shouldn't be someone in Washington, D.C. It should be someone in Denver, or in my case, in, I don't know, Bavaria or whatever. That this huge form of government that I think is really a big issue. Now, I guess the question then becomes, and this is, I think, what we're going to talk about now, is in what case is it immoral? And what makes us bound to follow the authority, even if we don't like it?
Yeah, and the answer is simply that all authority comes from God. And we can know this by just looking at the nature of man, but we also have a lot of quotes from not only the saints, and like Saints Peter and Paul, for example, speak a lot to this, but from our Lord himself, right? Our Lord, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. He's not saying disregard Caesar, I am the authority. He's saying, no, obey Caesar. To Pilate, when he said, thou should not have any power over me unless it were given to thee from above. He's directly there saying that Pilate's authority is not from this conquering Roman race that came in and took over, and just because through strength of force that they have authority over the people, that authority came from God.
So, but not directly though. It's willed by God.
It's yes. It's the authority of Caesar, whether that's Caesar or a president, comes from the authority of God. It's willed by God that person, that group, be in authority.
And I guess there are some decent forms of rebellion, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit. But in general, it's bad or even sinful to rebel against authority. And even when you start looking at it in terms of just common sense, it does make sense when you think about it. If Americans rose up and rebelled against Biden and overthrew him and placed on his throne in Washington, D.C., Donald Trump instead, sure, you're going to fix some things, but you're not going from a bad system to a perfect system. You're going from a bad system to a system that now has an unelected, or at least as far as we know, an unelected dictator.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you're going from a human system to another human system.
Right.
Right. And sure, there may be value judgments on the character of those individuals. There may be value judgments on the group of people that wants a certain person or party in power, but ultimately it's all human, right? And whether that, whether it's a republic, a democracy, or a dictatorship, that authority of that figure, the authority that that figure or figures have, that Caesar has, comes from God. And I wanted to she spends a lot of time talking about Saints Peter and Paul because they have quite a few quotes in their epistles regarding this. So if you don't mind, I was going to read a quote from St. Paul. Every soul must be submissive to its lawful superiors. Authority comes from God only, and all authorities that hold sway are of his ordinance. Thus, the man who opposes authority is a rebel against the ordinance of God, and rebels secure their own condemnation.
He doesn't mince words. Typical St. Paul, right?
and that's, as an American, that's tough to hear.
Yeah.
Right.
Why is that? Because our country was founded on rebellion.
Yes. Yes, it was. And so St. Peter has similar type of quotes, probably not as directly, eye-opening, I guess, as St. Paul's, but it's worth noting that, right, when Saints Peter and Paul were saying these words, the reigning authority was Nero, right?
Right.
It wasn't like he was a good guy. He was, perverted. He was quite literally probably insane. He had them both executed. And yet they still said these words regarding the respect of authority, earthly authority.
Yeah.
To me, when I read that, that was eye-opening for me. Right? Again, we're going straight into the politics, but do I like Biden? Do I think Biden is a good guy? No. You know what I mean?
Right.
Are many of his beliefs and policies against the moral law? Yeah, of course they are. Is his presidency potentially bad for society because he is ignoring that moral law? Yes. But does ultimately his authority come from God and he is to be respected by the people who are under his authority? Yes.
And so what if it was literally a stolen authority, which I'm sure that, many people listening believe that his actual presidency is actually not a valid one?
Sure. Was Nero's authority valid?
Yep. It's a good point, right?
Was Nero elected by a majority of the people?
No. And like you say, it's a hard pill to swallow, but I think, and you told me about this a few days ago, and it really sat with me, and it really I had to kind of think about it because it is a hard thing to think about and to take, because we're, especially as Americans, we are naturally rebellious because that's why we exist as Americans. But it also makes sense, because if you rebel, I mean, first of all, I think that there are several reasons. One, just in my mind, is one of them being you lose the true perspective of what actually matters, that you start focusing only on political issues and you start focusing on overthrowing the leadership.
It becomes your religion.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So
for your religion.
Politics. Right. So it's exactly right. And you see it. I mean, I've seen it with plenty of very good Catholics, that it just becomes too much of an obsession. And the other one being, right, who are you going to put in his place? And if you put someone who is a better man, someone who is better character, you're still disrupting society in a massive, massive way, because you're overthrowing what many people believe to be a validly elected ruler. And so it makes sense. It makes sense, I guess, both ways. And so again, it makes you have to question again. I mean, America as a whole was founded on rebellion.
Mm-hmm. Well, and keep in mind that it's not Saints Peter and Paul didn't just bow their heads and do everything Nero told them to do. They still went out and preached. They still went up directly against his laws, teaching, the truths of the faith. didn't offer incense to the, anything that was against the faith, they did not do. And ultimately that's why they were executed. But any laws, any, orders from authority that are not directly against the moral law or the law of the church are to be obeyed. whether it's a duly elected official in a republic, whether it's a conquering hero who happens to be the authority figure in the case of Nero, right? It's it's really tough. So there's a balance between just being a, mind-numbed zombie who goes around doing everything that the authority figure says, and respecting that authority's that respecting Caesar's authority, because that authority ultimately comes from God.
Yeah, and it's extremely humbling. I think it's very humbling, and I think it's something that anyone listening, I hope you go and take a few minutes or hours to consider it, because I think it's not a light subject, and I think it's a hard thing too, because it's hard to separate the fact that he is breaking some moral laws and asking other people to do so as well, be that whatever it is, and then trying to also remember that he is still the authority that you have to respect, and that's according to Saints Peter, Paul, and our Lord, and it hurts.
It does. And I think ultimately this is like the crux of this book and how it affected me, right? Because it wasn't just this book. I knew all authority comes from God, but it was just, it was one of those theoretical concepts. But when you see, Saints Peter and Paul going around saying, you must respect, it is your duty to respect the authority, the local authority, whether or not it's a good or bad authority, it's still the authority. That authority was given by God, therefore you must respect it. And, in the additional fact that their authority was potentially even worse than our authorities are.
And obviously, again, as you said, that's not in terms of faith or morals, that if they tell you to do something that's against faith or morals, then you can say no and be thrown in prison or killed, like St. Peter and Paul were. Yeah. And so, and I guess it's a hard thing again to take. I mean, what's an example, I guess, of something for you that's tough to swallow with this Biden administration that's clearly going to take some of the rights that we held or hold dear?
Sure. No. I mean, there's a whole bunch of examples, but one particular example for me is, like the Second Amendment. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's the right to bear arms for our non-Americans.
Right. I'm a big fan of that amendment. But ultimately, is that a moral law? Right. So for example, in Colorado, we have a magazine limit. Right. So you can't have 30 round magazines. I think it's cut off at 10 for handguns and 15 for rifles or something silly like that. I think it's a terrible law. Right. I think it's A, non-effective, and B, not according to the Constitution and the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. But ultimately, is that against the moral law? Is that against the law of the church?
No. Yeah. I mean, I don't think. I mean, it's a good question.
I mean, so I guess you could say that the law isn't applicable because the Second Amendment takes precedence over it, and it's therefore, you could go through some legal loopholes and rationalize out why I don't have to obey that law, but it's kind of a stretch.
Right.
You know what I mean? You could make the case that the Second Amendment implies that the citizens can have any sort of weaponry that exists, as being the intent of the Second Amendment. But if, say, for example, the Second Amendment were to get repealed, God forbid that the Second Amendment get repealed. But if it were to be, I would be committing a venial sin by knowingly owning a 30 round magazine here.
Right. And so I guess
because I'm breaking a law.
Right.
whether it's a good law or a bad law, it's a law that's not against the teachings of the church or moral law that is put in place by a valid authority.
And obviously, it doesn't mean you can't protest. It doesn't mean you can't, try to change it. You can't try to elect other people. That's obviously what you can't. What you don't do is break the law. But it makes sense too. Again, it's one of these things that the church and sanity makes sense. If you start thinking about it, if you don't obey these rules, then it all becomes your opinion of who is a fair or not a fair ruler. It's your choice. It's up to me. It's the whole. It's the Protestant way of thinking of there's no. I'm just going to choose whatever I want, and it's not even just Protestant. It's our world in general right now. It's up to me, and it's up to my instincts or whatever, and that's absolutely bound for disaster. We have to have rules, and we can't be the ones who set them.
No, and like that's a great point to sort of bring this back around to sanity. If it were up to me, who would be president? I could pick a handful of people that I'd like to be president. And I'm sure you could too,
right?
And if that person were president, great. They'd have good laws, they'd have common sense, they'd be in touch with sanity. But guess who wants the current president in power right now? God. Otherwise, he wouldn't be.
Right. At least, again, in terms of it being willed. I mean, not being actively God.
Sure, maybe not actively
Joe
willed,
Biden. Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Right. for whatever reason.
He wouldn't have allowed this. He wouldn't have allowed Nero to be in power back in the, in Christ's time and the Saints Peter and Paul's time if it wasn't for the greater good. Because anytime anything in this world becomes more evil than good, then he puts a stop to it or he changes it. So somehow in allowing this to be, and all the bad rulers, all the dictators, everyone in all of human history, that has been allowed by God, and it's been allowed by God because it's for the greater good. Yeah. And again, that's not to say that we shouldn't act upon our decisions and our judgments. That's not to say like, we just kind of bend over and just, bow down and say, this is, God's will. Therefore, I'm not going to resist. We do our best. We vote. We inform people. We, try to do our best to learn so that we ourselves know what's best and, act on it as far as we can. But ultimately, if a ruler is in power, God has allowed it, and it's going to be for the greater good.
Yeah, and ultimately on the other side of that too, I think there's the two sides to the coin. The other side is it's just not worth our time. Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's good to be. You need to be aware of it. You need to share, really valuable information, and you need to inform yourself. But you just can't take all of your time and put it into political things because it's just not the most important thing. As we see, for goodness sake, we were all mostly happy during the last 4 years, and there are plenty of people who are mostly miserable during the last 4 years, and now it's going to flip-flop. And especially in America, that's how things work. In Germany, it's very different. You've had the same leader for 16 years, and it's consistently degraded. Mm-hmm. And we're not so, we're not like a roller coaster like in America, but it's still the same, difference that in the end, what are we going to do? You do your best, you vote for the best person, and then you just I think you have to move on. I mean, because if you don't, you will go insane because there are some things that you cannot fix. And it's a practical thing too, that, we do follow authority because that is God's will and that's what we must do. But it's also because it's for our own good. It's for our own sake of security. Like little children, we need someone to tell us what to do. And obviously in this case, if they tell us immoral things, we don't do them. Mm-hmm. But still, we need that structure, and if we don't have that, then we'll rebel and put it in another government that ends up being just as bad.
Yep. Yeah. No, and it's very easy to go down that slippery slope and then become, just to become depressed or to give up hope, to despair. But ultimately, there has to be that trust in God, and that trust in God can manifest itself and should manifest itself in respecting the earthly authority. whether or not we agree with it, whether or not it's moral, as long as it's not against the teachings of the church and the moral law, we should respect it. And we can do that with good conscience, knowing that the saints have done that and that Christ and his apostles taught that.
Yeah, and that's definitely right. And I think that it's hard for us because I think we are patriots. We want the best for America. We love America, and when we see someone leading it in a direction that we don't think to be American, it's tough. But it doesn't mean you rebel and break the law.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, moving on. Like we definitely got hung up there. Some good discussion, right. I think. But the next point that Sheed makes in his book is that, going back to the reverence of man, Caesar has to reverence his citizens in order for society to work and be healthy, but also that citizens have to reverence Caesar, not as necessarily only an authority figure, but also as a man. And in Sheed's words, he says, it's hard to tell who has the tougher task, right? And very much an American thing, or, is you look at your rulers, you look at Congress, you look at the president, and you say, man, what an idiot. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, if only I were there, I could do so much better. But, put yourself into one of their positions, right? Imagine yourself being elected president. You'd be a great president, right?
Of course.
You'd just be awesome until, 50, 60, 95% of the people decide to hate you. Even if you have the most well-meaning intentions, right? You decide to balance the budget. Well, now you have millions of people yelling at you that you're cutting off the support that they've been, the welfare that they've been accustomed to receiving. You build a program to help the genuinely poor and unable to help themselves, right? Like a legitimate welfare type of system, but now you're causing a nanny state to a bunch of other people. Right. I mean, just if you truly put yourself in that position and you think about what you would do and what the reaction would be.
I'll tell you, I got to interrupt. I'll tell you my solution is don't have big government. Because back in the day when you had, say, feudal states that was much more led by a local lord or something, and most of the first of all, people died much earlier, so that's a different problem. That we have people live longer and they survive through injuries and stuff, so it makes it so it's much harder to support the people on the outside of society because there are just more of them. But back in the day, that was mostly run by the Catholic Church, which was supported by people's alms. So society took care of society. So it actually was more of a social system that worked through the church. And this only worked because it was much, much more local. I think a huge problem around the world is trying to imagine how these huge countries can manage themselves and govern themselves when it just shouldn't be that big. I mean, I think it's a pretty simple solution, in my opinion. But again,
sure, but I don't think it solves all the problems. What happens when China invades and yet there is no federal government?
Yeah,
right? Are each individual state just going to put their militia around their borders?
You probably have some ruling group that get together and try to work together like they did in say in England against the Vikings. You had the different kingdoms that all hated each other and fought each other, and the Vikings invaded, and they all said, "Oh shoot, well we better get together and work together now." But though ironically, after that happened, they ended up having a one king shortly afterwards. Yes. Right? I guess in the end,
it goes back to one of the functions of society.
Right.
The family can't fulfill all of its needs by itself. It needs the society to do so, and national security is a big one of those.
True.
And I'd also again, I'm a small government, local government guy. You know that, but just making the governments smaller and the reach of Caesar smaller and more defined isn't going to take away all those issues.
No, of course. Of course. It makes them smaller because the government is smaller.
Yes. You're building with less effective material instead of more. Yeah,
exactly. But we can dream, right? That's my perfect world scenario.
Yep, exactly. And so yeah, and that's where Sheed is going is we have to understand that when we're looking at Caesar, whether it's a president or Congress or whatever, all of his or their faults are on display, right? His ideas will never match any one single citizen's, let alone a majority. The very fact that we have a republic or a democratic system of voting where citizens put Caesar into office is that it gives them the illusion that his authority comes from them, not from God.
Right.
And to a certain extent, it does, right? I mean, we do have an effect on who is elected president. We do have an effect on, the makeup of Congress. But ultimately, their authority, even though our votes put them there, their authority does not come from us. It comes from God. And so that's a very easy, slippery slope for us to fall down, particularly in a democratic type society.
Exactly, because that's the issue that I think. I mean, but again, you can go back to Nero. That was also not a good form of government. But I mean, democracy. We could talk. We could do a whole show on democracy. Actually, I want to do a whole show on democracy. Maybe you can come on and we can talk democracy, because democracy, was founded really in the French Revolution, or I mean maybe slightly before the American Revolution. I mean, and as Americans, we've been taught, and I'm sure all the other Western countries mostly have been taught, that it is the form of government that is to be revered, and it's perfect, and it was founded by good, holy, perfect men, and it's just so wrong. It blows my mind that people have been so that the wool has been pulled over their eyes so strongly that it's such a corrupt system that it will never really work.
Yeah, and like you said, a topic probably for another day.
For sure.
At a high level, like true democracy is mob rule, right? Whoever is yelling the loudest or who has the most people yelling is the correct,
exactly.
Right. And that's not true, right? If 51% of the people say that I think we should abolish the law of gravity and everyone should, instead of using planes, we should just jump off of cliffs and flap our wings. Right. That doesn't make that right. And that's a very, very quick way to have a society crumble.
Well, and I think it's another microcosm of the issue with society is it's people putting too much value on themselves, that they put themselves as the all being and the most important part when it's actually the society that matters. It's like if you actually cared about your neighbors and actually cared about your family and society more than you cared about yourself, then you'd have a lot fewer issues in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. But yeah, and this goes back to the point that the church has never specified, right, this is the ideal form of government.
Right.
And they did that for a reason, because the government of a society has to take into account the makeup of its citizens.
Right.
And, so one big thing, particularly on the political right, that I tend to disagree with is imposing our social system on other countries. Right. That this was a big thing in the Bush years in the mid 2000s was, democracy is the way to go, or even a republic is the way to go if you phrase it that way. And so we're going to take all these countries with people that do not have the same background as we do, that do not have the same thought processes that we do, and you're imposing the system of government. A, it's straight up never going to work, and B, it's actually an immoral, wrong thing to do in the same way that imposing communism on a society is. It's a system that is not going to work for the makeup of its people.
Right, and it's something that I think it's an extremely arrogant thing, and it's been a big issue of America for many years that our way is right and that the rest of the world should do it, or they're wrong. Not even just that they're wrong or that they're stupid, but that we're going to make you do it. I mean, you do it or else, kind of, and it has been an issue. And I think that it's as you say, it's bad, it's sinful, but it also doesn't make sense. And I think that if anyone here has traveled to any and gotten to see different forms of government and stuff, you'll see, they're not good. None of them are, as we've talked about at length, but they all have different aspects that work and different ones that don't. And to think that our way is perfect is really, again, it's naive. It's the right wing version of naivete that you just think that American way is best.
Yeah, and Sheed puts this perfectly in his book, where he says it's an insult to democracy to install a ballot box in a third world country and then call that country democratic. Right? The system, whether it's a democracy or republic, that's again a topic for another day. The system in place was developed over generations, right? And to be effective, it requires that the individuals making up that society, they have to be interested in the voting process. They have to, be researched. They have to be well-meaning. They have to be grounded in fact, right? All these things for that system to work. And so just imposing this system because you think it's a great system on people and, individuals that do not have that same background is just not going to work. And that shows you the wisdom of the church in the fact that she has never said, this is the ideal way to make up a society.
Totally. And I seriously could talk on and on about democracy. I really mean it. We're going to do another show on democracy because I want to I have so much I want to say.
When you get a bunch of negative feedback from having me on, maybe you'll just never have me on again.
Then I'll talk by myself about democracy. Okay. But actually, again, to go off track a little bit, I really want to do a show or several shows sometimes talking about different isms, the different, what is communism, fascism, humanism, all these different things, and then talk about, exactly, and talk about what they are and if the church condemns them. But that's for a future time. I think that would be a really, really interesting show for me, at least. That's something that I really want to learn about. But I think we need to kind of wrap this up because
sure.
Mostly because of me, I'm meandering along the way. So what's the last thought, I guess, or what's the last topic that Sheed or you want to bring up?
Yeah, no, and Sheed wraps it up quite nicely. And again, this is written back in the 50s. But he said the biggest threat to modern Western civilization isn't that Caesar being the president, Congress, whoever, overreaching. It's society, and that's made up of both the individual citizens as well as Caesar, losing sight of the reality of man, right, and the reality of God's laws. So the biggest issue, and I think most of us would probably identify with this, is the loss of sanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. And then, like I said, this was published back in 53.
Yeah, right.
You had told Sheed back in 53 that, the Second Vatican Council would happen and that we'd lose, our authority with regards to the church and her teachings, and communism would continue to proliferate and all of this stuff. I think he would be surprised at how honestly well off Western civilization is currently. And I say that,
True.
Sort of tongue in cheek, like we're not particularly well off, but given all of those things, it's definitely a blessing.
Yeah, it really is incredible. And I think that, maybe people can take the whole show and think, again, everything's bad, everything's miserable, no good form of government. We have to listen to bad leaders. And I don't think that's not the way that I think it should be, that should come across. I think that the way we got to look at it is to be the sane ones and to try to lead the most sane life we can. And that is by really truly following our Baltimore Catechism. I mean, really the basic tenets of our faith, and not getting lost in the political situation in the world.
Yes. And that's another takeaway I took from the book, which is, we have to be part of the solution, but we're not part of the solution by political alone. Right. So one of the big concerns I have for, a lot of Catholics, and, this was myself, but like hatred of people, hatred of Caesar. Right.
Right.
Keep in mind, right, Christ died on the cross for Biden. Christ would have died on the cross if it were to save Biden's soul alone, right? He died on the cross for Pelosi. He loves, AOC, Ocasio-Cortez. He loves her and desires her salvation infinitely. How can we, and how do we justify hating them or wishing them ill? right? When we do that, we're losing sanity ourselves. We're disregarding reality in the very same way that we, often attack those on the political left for. So that was a huge takeaway for me.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful. I think, love every human being for their true value and their incredible value, because, as you've said, that they were created by God. The soul lives forever, and because Christ died for them. And I think that's a good way to end the show. And I think that, maybe we rambled a bit about politics and stuff, but I think when it comes down to it, that's kind of the main thing, right? That we want to be part of returning sanity back to society, and there's a way to do it.
Mm-hmm. It starts with us. It starts with the faith, and it starts with seeing things for what they are and actually acting upon that. So
perfect. Eric, thanks so much for coming on. We'll come back again sometime to talk about different forms of government. We could definitely do a show about that. I don't know if anyone's going to want to listen to two 30-year-olds talking about how we don't like democracy. But anyway, we'll do it anyway for our own, just to hear ourselves talk. Yeah. And
I was going to tell you, just feel free to direct all hate mail towards me.
Will do. Actually, speaking of which, if you have any questions for me or Eric, even though, again, we're not moral authorities or any experts on this material at all, please go ahead and send me an email at kevin89davis@gmail.com. Otherwise, Eric, thanks for coming on. Everyone else, thanks for listening. And as always, God bless.
You've been listening to the Catholic Family Podcast. If you enjoyed this show, please share it with your friends and family. You can support the production on Patreon and PayPal, and you can reach Kevin at kevin89davis@gmail.com. Ad maiorem Dei Gloriam, all for the greater glory of God.